Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing my first Sharks player review of the 23-24 season. And as per usual, we start off with the highest rated player and slowly make our way down to the lowest rated player on the team. And leading the way here is Mikael Granlund, not only the Sharks' best forward and leading scorer of this past season, but also just the best player in general. And this comes as a bit of a surprise because when Mikael Granlund was originally acquired in the Erik Karlsson trade, it was viewed as more of a salary cap dump type of situation. The real value that the Sharks were actually getting in that deal was the first round pick from Pittsburgh. But because Erik Karlsson was making so much money on his contract over the next few years, to make room and make it actually work, the Penguins had to give up a couple of contracts. So they give up Ruda, they give up Mikael Granlund, players who were viewed as a bit over the hill. And that's not that much of a surprise, as Granlund had been on a bit of a downward trend over the last few seasons with the Penguins and primarily with the Nashville Predators. Granlund was at one point a very effective forward in the NHL. In fact, one of the more underrated players in the league. His prime point total came in the 16-17 season where he put up 69 points, which may not seem particularly good these days since scoring is way up. 69 points would be like outside of the top 50 in the league this year. But at the time, that would have been tied for 20th in the league. An extremely impressive output. It's just that he was on a Minnesota Wild team that was viewed as exceptionally mediocre. They would either make the playoffs and eliminate themselves in the first round, or, be within like 2 or 3 spots of a playoff position. So you weren't really talking about the Minnesota Wild as a real competitive franchise. And so Granlund's name was kind of kept off the radar, but he was always quite good. But he was traded then to the Nashville Predators, where he was still decent, had a couple of okay years, but was very inconsistent. And then last year at the deadline was traded to the Pittsburgh Penguins, where he was simply not good, and as such was an expendable member of that team, and he came over to San Jose, and it looked as though he was going to be stuck behind both Tomas Hertl and Logan Couture for the center position, maybe just be the third guy there, get 15, 16 minutes of ice time, second power play time, and put up maybe 40 points max, and just kind of live out the last couple of years of his career, go to unrestricted free agency, and then maybe get signed on a small deal. But instead, the major event occurred, which was Logan Couture's injury that kept him out for pretty much most of this past season, all but 6 games, which meant that from the first game of the year, Mikael Granlund was a top 6 player, a top 2 center for the San Jose Sharks. And as time passed, especially once Hertl obviously got injured and then eventually traded to the Vegas Golden Knights, Mikael Granlund slowly began to assert himself not only as the number 1 center for the San Jose Sharks, but as the number 1 player in general, heavily relied on by David Quinn in every possible situation. Taking a look, he played 69 games played, which means he missed a brief stint due to injury. He had 12 goals and 48 assists for 60 points. As I mentioned when Granlund was originally acquired from the Pittsburgh Penguins, he has always been much more of a playmaker than anything else. Pretty much a pure playmaker, a Joe Thornton type of guy. So while his shot is actually not terrible, and he showed it off multiple times this season, which helped him get to those 12 goals, he is much preferred to just pass the puck, which he did a ton of times this year. And as such, he had quadrupled the amount of assists and goals to put up those 60 points, and he led the way by a hefty margin amongst any other Sharks player on the team. Now, it should be noted there is the classical argument that people will have when it comes to these really bad teams, that even though a really bad team might finish right at the bottom of the standings, they do still have to score some goals. A team that averages less than 2 goals per game will still have, like 160 goals over a full 82-game season. Somebody needs to be scoring those goals. Somebody needs to be getting those points. And so inevitably, there will be a player on that team who will have, 40, 50, 60 points or something along those lines. And perhaps Granlund is just that type of player, as in to say that he's not actually doing particularly well. He's just the best out of a bad situation. And so he accumulates this amount of points. But I don't necessarily think that's the case, because watching Granlund play this season, he was actually quite good in a lot of those games. Yes, there were the, performances against really good teams like Colorado or Edmonton, who have these high caliber centermen who Mikael Granlund cannot possibly go toe to toe with. But when the Sharks faced off against more middle of the pack to lower tier type of competition, the types of teams that are more in line with the guys that the San Jose Sharks have, obviously the Sharks still can't compete just due to a lack of depth, and that's why the Sharks finished dead last. But at least from the top level, Granlund can at the very least do decently well against them. He did exactly that. His even strength play was rather solid. His power play was quite good, helped the Sharks get a respectable power play for the first time in a few years. And generally, yeah, you could say his point totals were somewhat inflated by the fact that nobody else is going to be doing the scoring on this team, but still 60 points, pretty impressive. When it comes to his plus minus, a minus 23 is not going to look good on paper, but for a team that put up the worst mark in the modern NHL history, in the salary cap era in the NHL, minus 23 is honestly not terrible. And then when you take a look at his time on ice, you can indeed see just how much David Quinn relied on Granlund this past season in 5-on-5, 4-on-4, 3-on-3, overtimes, power play, penalty kill, all of these types of positions, 20 minutes and 58 seconds. That is a full 2 minutes, and actually more than 2 minutes, than the next closest forward on the San Jose Sharks. In fact, if you take a look at forwards around the league itself, Mikael Granlund is tied for 11th in terms of forward time on ice. And interestingly enough, he's also the oldest player out of that group of forwards, which is extremely impressive because it is not, unheard of for a 24 or a 25-year-old who is in the prime of their career to get 22 minutes of ice time if they're just really that good, a McKinnon, a McDavid, a Mikko Rantanen, these types of players. But for a guy who is 32 years of age to be putting up almost 21 minutes of ice time per game, that is an extremely impressive output for him. And so now the major question moving into next season is what happens with Mikael Granlund? What is his fate in relation to the San Jose Sharks? Because now he's on the final year of his contract, 1 year left, $5 million, which opens him up for a rental type of situation. The major wrinkle in that is that the San Jose Sharks do not have the ability to retain money on his contract because all three of their retention slots are taken up right now by Brent Burns, Erik Karlsson, and the recent addition of Tomas Hertl, which means any team that acquires Granlund either has to go through a third party, which is a viable move, but would require the Sharks to give up a small asset to make it work, or they would have to find a team that is willing to take on that full $5 million, which, especially at the midpoint of the season where teams are within just a couple $100,000, if not just a couple thousand of the salary cap, is exceptionally difficult to do. So there are a few recourses that the Sharks can do. As I mentioned, there is that third party type of team that the Sharks could include. Someone would likely have to give like a 4th or 5th round pick, either the Sharks doing it themselves or the team that Mikael Granlund is being traded to would have to give that up, which means generally in both cases less value than for the San Jose Sharks. Or the Sharks would have to trade Granlund and get some salary cap back, which would then generally lower the sort of future value that the Sharks would get in a trade like that. So instead of, let's say, being able to grab a 3rd round pick or something, they'd get like a 5th round pick and then a roster player who makes $3 million, something like that. Or maybe the more interesting move would be the Sharks to trade Mikael Granlund before the start of this next season, where teams have not yet finalized their salary cap situation, and so it is a lot more possible to fit in that $5 million. However, considering Granlund having not been all that consistent in his few previous years with both Pittsburgh and Nashville, there may not be any suitors that are willing to take that chance on a player who is a leading scorer on the worst team in the league. So it'll be interesting to see if the Sharks can actually find a guy. But another question could be whether or not the Sharks actually do want to trade Granlund in the first place, especially if both Macklin Celebrini and Will Smith come over to San Jose, and if Logan Couture is not a viable option just due to the unpredictability of his current injury. It might be in the Sharks' best interest to have a veteran type of strong centerman at the NHL level to be a bit of a leader, especially in a two-way sense at the NHL level for these young future star sentiments for the San Jose Sharks. So it might even be in the Sharks' best interest to actually keep Granlund for the entirety of this season just to be that type of leader for this very, very young group of players. But we shall see. In terms of the grade that Granlund ends up getting, it is the grade of a B+. It should have been a bit higher, but Granlund out the gate for San Jose really did struggle. He had something like 4 assists through the first 13 or 15 games for the San Jose Sharks. It was not a very good start to the year, but as it wore on, he got significantly better. Like I said, ended up being the leading point scorer, and so the grade of a B+ is deserved and pretty good on a team that is otherwise pretty low graded. Class dismissed.